Wednesday in Tryon, North Carolina, and again it's been warm, but a little bit overcast from time to time, keeping things bearable. Compared to Florida, still pretty cool, but nevertheless hot for up here, and this is the time of year when it does get warm up here. We're talking in Proverbs, and we've been looking at the purpose of Proverbs, which is training in righteousness. And we realize that the first 9 chapters are written to young people. And as a result, we have a number of references to women. And since the title is My Son, Listen, or Give Attention, My Son, but this can be reversed. This also can be to young ladies who also need to understand the same temptations that young men need to understand. We need to go back and look at some principles that all temptation comes in one of 3 ways: lust of the eye, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. Now, certainly men are much more subject to the lust of the eye. We're all very subject to the lust of the flesh, and we're all very subject to the pride of life. So when we look at chapter 5 today, we need to understand that the psalmist, the proverb writer, is dealing with lust and flesh and dealing with temptation. And here in chapter 5 it says, "My son, give attention, incline your ear." Once again, we see that what it means is that we're supposed to give extra attention. We're supposed to deliberately listen carefully to what's being said. And it says, observe discretion. Now, most of the time when we think of the word discretion, we think about being discreet or not telling anybody about something, but that's not the only definition for discretion. Discretion also means one who's able to judge. And so here the application would be for us to be able to judge. And in verse 3, he goes on and says, the lips of an adulteress drip with honey. That is, those that are trying to entice you to evil will say the flattering things, the sweet things, in order to take down some of your resistance. And certainly I remember listening to a so-called chaplain of Bourbon Street who used to say, we try to dress up words to make them sound less sinful. We talk about having an affair rather than saying he or she is an adulteress because it sounds nice, or somebody embezzled funds instead of saying he's a thief. Well, here we are seeing the same thing. We're seeing that an ace is being called an ace, an adulteress. Drips with honey, but that doesn't mean a common prostitute. That also means anyone that would entice you to evil, and that the charge would still be the same. Fornication and adultery are both sins that are covered widely in the scriptures and are common in our society today. And so young people are to be very careful, whether it's the flattering lips of a young man or whether it's the flattering lips of a young lady who are trying to entice the opposite sex into a physical relationship. And it tells you the end of this kind of a relationship. It says the end is down to death and Sheol. It talks about the fact that this will lead to death, this will lead to ruin. And we need to be sure that we stay away from these kinds of enticements, these kinds of temptations. And interestingly enough, this proverb says that she does not even consider the path of life. That is, when this temptation comes, whether it be from a male or a female, this temptation person doesn't even consider the way of life, or the way that they're headed, which is the way to death, the wages of sin are death. So we see this person who is then described in verse 6 as being unstable and doesn't even know that they are unstable. Remember, we go back all the way to chapter 2, verse 16, where it says that an adulteress flatters. So when somebody of the opposite sex begins to flatter you, begins to drip with honey, and begins to talk about the things that they think you'd want to hear, in chapter 5, verse 3, it says, smoother than oil. Be on guard. Be on guard, for their motives may not be honorable. The flattery and the sweet words may be just a word of enticement. And remember what the end of that enticement is. The wages of sin are death. And many times these that are trying to entice don't understand the ways of life. They don't understand what's godly, and they don't even consider the path of life. A few minutes of pleasure, is it worth all of the cost? Most of us know somebody who has had an adulterous affair or has been involved in fornication, has become lured by the flattery and the honey lips, and they've paid a terrible, terrible price for it. And most of the time, I think if you were to ask any of those people that have gone that way, they would say that it was not worth the few minutes of pleasure. So I hope that you'll remember that when somebody begins to flatter you, that you might question their motives, particularly when it's somebody of the opposite sex, and be sure that you keep your path of righteousness before you. That's your thought for the day. God bless you and have a great day.